from the campus of the Connecticut School of Broadcasting in the beautiful city of Palm Beach, Florida. This is Grinder's Corner, the podcast you won't stop talking about for days. And now, here's Jeff Greiner.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Antonio, welcome back to Grinder's Corner.
Thank you, Jeff. How are you today?
Very well, thanks. Very well. It's still hot and muggy here in Florida. And
It always is.
I thought by November it would be a little bit better.
It's not till January. Actually.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll go back in the cocoon. Today's guest, a very special guest today. He's appeared on ABC World News. He was on Nightline 2020, Good Morning America. He's won 2 Emmys, nominated for many others. He won the Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Professional Journalists. And in 2004, he was a correspondent for HD Net TV, which we're going to talk about.
Wow.
His name is Greg Dobbs. Greg, welcome to Grinder's Corner.
Well, thank you very much. And after that introduction, even I want to meet me.
Greg, we go back many years. As I was talking to you before, I was at ABC in the late 70s. I know it makes it seem I'm only 30 years old. I don't know how that could be, but I was. And I remember you feeding in the pieces all the time, and I was in videotape, and it was a pleasure working with you then. And I followed some of your career. You've done a ton of stuff. So I just want to talk about that stuff. But first, can you give me a little information about you and what got you started in this business?
Well, what really got me started in the business, Jeff, was my college career at the University of California at Berkeley in the mid-1960s. There were big college demonstrations. It was all called the free speech movement. And I wasn't particularly involved, but I was a fascinated spectator. And I began to recognize the same grown-ups every day watching and taking notes, and they were the reporters. And I got up the guts one day to go up to one of them, the guy I had seen day in and day out, and introduce myself and say, "Do you always get to go where the action is?" And this guy said to me, sort of patted me on the back and said, "Sure, kid. When this story's over, I'll go someplace else exciting." And by and large, I have thanked him over the years, but there have been days in my career when I have condemned him.
And that was
just
why?
A few of them.
Why is that?
Well, tough days when I had to do tough things and saw bad things and had friends killed right next to me overseas.
Mm-hmm.
There are some very tough days, as you well know, covering the world as at least we used to cover it. But by and large, I've had a front row seat for most of my life to the pieces of history that I got to see.
Yes, indeed. You're known to be a terrific storyteller, and that is so important in television. That's what puts regular reporters ahead of better reporters, that you really get to know how to tell a story. How did you learn that? Where did you get that knowledge?
It's a great question for which I don't have a great answer. All I can tell you is that if anybody gets to have as many interesting experiences as I've gotten to have, and then you stand around when you get home and tell somebody for 3 minutes at a cocktail party what you just got to do, well, you try to use the same technique on the air or in print as you do at the cocktail party. You just tell a story and say to yourself, well, what would interest me if I were in the audience? And that's what you try to include.
It's interesting because it's not easy to do. It's not everyone can do that. They're not good storytellers. They're good reporters, but there's something about telling a story that you always did very well. And that's a special thing. You did a lot. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I will show maybe a little false modesty and say it wasn't that I was such a good storyteller, but I had such good stories to tell.
Okay.
I got to be involved with the Yasser Arafats and the Muammar Gaddafis and the Desmond Tutus of the world. And if they were interesting characters, then it was a good story to tell. I got to cover the civil war in Beirut and the revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and other stories of that magnitude. And they were incredible stories, so it wasn't too hard to tell them.
You must be reading my notes, because that's what exactly was my next question. What it was like to be a foreign correspondent for a network news organization.
This guy's just showing off now, Jeff.
Yeah, he's got tremendous stories. What do you remember most, or least, of being a foreign correspondent?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I can remember some incidents that made me wish sometimes that I had gone to law school instead.
Right.
I mean, I remember a time I was looking for one of the main suppliers of arms to one of the militias in Beirut during the civil war there. And I had gotten in touch with his number 2 man, call him the intermediary, and we met in a neutral part of Beirut at a coffee shop. And while we were sitting there together, beginning to negotiate for what I wanted, which was an interview with the main man, three big, heavy thugs with machine guns over their shoulders walked right into the coffee shop and reached across our table and pulled this guy across the table, upsetting the table, turning it over, throwing all the china on the floor, pulled him out kicking and screaming. This guy was never seen again. So when you ask, what do you remember? Well, you remember incidents like that. Or being chased by a gang with machetes in Tehran during the revolution there. And Jeff, since you and I worked for the same network for a while, for ABC News, I will tell you that we were doing it so we wouldn't have to surrender the expensive television equipment. We might have been the biggest jerks on earth back then because these guys were gaining on us. But, you remember those specifics. And if you live to tell the story, then, as I say, they're good for 3 minutes at a cocktail party.
Oh, that's more than 3 minutes. That's pretty scary.
Yeah.
And you went back for more, huh, Greg?
And I went back for more. My wife tried to stop me.
Wow.
I did go back for more. But maybe a more substantive answer is this. In a way, when you say, what do you remember? What you remember is that you have the best job on earth because you get a front row seat. You get to follow your nose. You get to think about, everybody has a natural human curiosity, and you get to pursue it. You get to see it firsthand and not depend on other people to tell you how it's working. You get the adrenaline rush. You also get the satisfaction in difficult places of beating the bad guys at their own game. I can't tell you how many countries in which I worked where we had to, break the rules and sometimes break the laws to get the story out. And we did it with the greatest of satisfaction.
That's great. That's great. I tell that to my students as well. One of the things you have to have if you want to work in news is to be curious. You have to be curious. You have to want to know more. And that's what makes a reporter a better reporter or a better news person. Someone who digs and knows how to get those answers, but is always curious.
I'll take it even a step further. You have to be the kind of person, if you're going to be a good journalist, who, if you're stuck in a traffic jam and you can't see what's causing it, will get out of your car and walk or run ahead until you can. Everyone else is sitting in their cars, but you just can't stand not knowing why you're sitting there, and so you get out. And I've done that. I've done that in blizzards. I've done it in the middle of the night, and sometimes I confound my wife. Once I did it, and suddenly this traffic started moving, and we were on a freeway, and she jumped over into the driver's seat and drove forward until she saw me running backwards on the shoulder of the road, hoping she would spot me before she passed by.
Wow. You've done some great work with one of my heroes, Dan Rather. And I worked with him for many years at CBS while he was at CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. He's actually going to do the podcast with me at some point. And you did a lot of the launches. You did a lot of space stuff, and space amazes me. I actually went one time with my son to watch the last space shuttle go up, and it was nothing like it. You can't explain that to people, what it's like to see these mammoth things go up. What were your experiences like working with NASA?
Well, my experience for the 35 to 40 space shuttle launches that I covered, from every one of which I did a live broadcast for HDNet television from the Kennedy Space Center, my experience was what you just described, but it was the same every time because every launch somehow is different. It's a different mission, sometimes a different destination. The lighting is different, the time of day is different, the trajectory is different. The astronauts inside, who I was lucky enough to get to know, are different. And so every single time, I also got to see a couple of Apollo launches, and it's the same. You are infused, and I'll bet, Jeff, you remember feeling the same thing.
Yes.
You're infused with a sense of awe about the technology and the engineering and the behind-the-scenes people who made it happen, but also for the heroism of the people inside, because they are always just a millimeter from disaster. And, there's a sense of patriotism that somehow, takes over your every sense. And I mean, every one of them, I wouldn't give up. And I was sorry when the program ended for a number of reasons. But I was personally sorry after seeing 35 to 40 of them that I wouldn't get to see anymore.
I'm with you on that. We got a tour once because we were in the press. An astronaut actually gave my son and I a tour through all of the facility. And it was just, you're jaw-dropping. It's just amazing how they do all this stuff. It's just incredible. Do you think these space shots are going to continue, or where do you think this is going? Have we just stopped doing this stuff?
Oh, no, I don't think
Like
so at all.
the shuttles, they've stopped doing shuttles.
Well, the shuttle is dead. As a matter of fact, I think there was 3 surviving shuttles out of the original 5 are all museum pieces now, and they've been basically stripped down. And the shuttle is only yesterday's technology anyway, Jeff. It's not tomorrow's technology. For the kinds of missions they're going to want to run in the future, which are going to take us well beyond, the International Space Station that's orbiting whatever it is, a couple hundred miles above us.
Right.
They're going to need a whole different kind of spacecraft. They're talking about all kinds of concepts, including, for example, sending some sort of a cargo vessel into orbit, and then in a separate vehicle, sending astronauts who would then rendezvous with the cargo vessel out there in space. And the purpose of that is to avoid the loss of so much fuel, which you use just to break the bonds of the Earth's atmosphere.
Right.
They're talking about using the equivalent of laser beams to actually beam fuel into space, so that you don't have to carry the fuel from the ground.
Wow,
of our planet.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
One thing I mentioned to the astronaut there, I'm curious to know what you think. I have a feeling a lot of people don't know why the space shuttle was going up, and I think that may be one reason why it went away, because I don't think people understood why they were sending them up. What did we get out of it? And he said, you're right, and some of it is a PR issue. Somehow I don't think people really understood the value of these space shots. Do you think they did?
I think you're right. I think they did not. And I also agree with your assessment that if this is what you're saying, that NASA did not do nearly as good a job as it could have done and should have done to excite people and educate them. There are all kinds of things we got out of the space program. I'm a homeboy for the space program because, number one, it is man's natural instinct to explore. And in the old days, it was Christopher Columbus on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Today, it's a vehicle going into space. But we also got a lot out of it. And it was interesting. I made a couple of documentaries in Russia because we now depend, as you know, on the Russians to take our astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Eventually, we're going to be putting them on homegrown vehicles again, but for the time being, they're all going up on Soyuz to the space station, which we share with the Russians, the Europeans, the Japanese. And my gosh, the technology that goes into it is almost beyond belief, because they are always sometimes people at the Johnson or Kennedy Space Centers would hold their fingers tightly together and say, we're always this close to disaster. There's no space between their fingers. So, what did we get out of it? We got all kinds of technology that was developed for the space program. And the reason I mentioned Russia is because they didn't. Interestingly, back when the Soviet Union was running their space program, they didn't have the mentality that exists, of course, in the capitalist United States of America to share the technology with the people and make money from it. So everything from your polarized sunglasses to acoustic guitars to fireproof materials, to the Dustbuster, the Black & Decker Dustbuster. That's where NASA went to private industry and said, we're going to need something to scoop up moon dust when we go to the moon. What can you do? They developed something that was then turned into the commercial application, which we call the Dustbuster.
That's clever. That's clever. So you know all this space stuff. So the question to you is, do you think there's life out there besides us?
It's just hard for me to. It's not because I know any space.
I thought maybe you had some inside dirt.
It's hard for me to believe there isn't. It's just hard to believe there isn't. Why would it be we're the only ones
I know.
in this universe?
We're all Martians,
what do you
man.
think?
I definitely think there's something out there. Oh, no question.
Yeah.
There has to be.
And I'll take it a step farther. There are plenty of scientists who will argue, well, it's unlikely that there's life, but in a very few places, because they don't have the oxygen, they don't have the A, B, C, and D that
they use something else, right?
Yeah. Who's to say that you have to have what we need to produce intelligent life?
Greg, it reminds me of the joke that David Brenner once told me when I interviewed him. He said the United States, NASA, spent $3 million to try to figure out if they can make a pen that you can write upside down, sideways, all different ways. And the Russians figured it out. They got a pencil. It was just very funny.
The Russians, I mean, first of all, they were the first in space. The Soviets in those days, they put a man in orbit before we put a man in, Alan Shepard, into one suborbital flight, and they made a lot of inroads in space. But the funny thing is, they have a whole different view of risk. If you don't, can I tell you a little story?
Sure.
This is probably 7 or 8 years ago. I went to the Yuri Gagarin Space Flight Center, which is Yuri Gagarin was the first human being, the Russian, in space.
Right.
And it's like our Johnson Space Center. It's not where they launch, but it's where they live and train. And it's in a birch forest, like 80 miles outside of Moscow, situated there back because of the days of the Cold War. It was kind of hidden there. And we being the United States now, NASA always has a presence there of several They built little American-style cottages with white picket fences for them to inhabit for the 3 months or so they're there, because they got to learn the Soyuz, the Russian systems, to get up and back and to work in the space station. And I was asking one of the chief astronaut at the time about the difference in risk. You know, at the Kennedy Space Center, as you might recall, the nearest, or I should say the closest human beings to the launch pad for the space shuttle, and the same launch pad that Apollo went to the moon from, are 3.1 miles away from the pad.
That's where we were.
Direction.
Right.
That's considered the blast radius.
Right.
And meaning if it blows up, nothing goes quite that far.
Right.
And there are a few people in a bunker closer to help at a last minute abortion. But basically, that's the launch control people, the journalists, the VIPs, other astronauts are 3.1 miles away.
Right.
He shows me a picture. We're talking about risk. He shows me his screensaver on his computer. We are at the Yuri Gagarin Space Flight Center in Russia, and there is a flight he had previously taken from Kazakhstan, from which they launch, and there is a photographer on the ground. This thing is not photoshopped. He isn't 300 yards away. And the flames are shooting from the bottom of this thing. The photograph is taken from a tower somewhere, not very far away. And there's this guy standing just a few hundred yards away.
Wow.
And he said the only difference between them and us is, if we have a sharp stick, we have to put a sticker on it in the United States saying, don't poke yourself in the eye with this sharp stick.
Right.
He said there they just know.
Right.
Fearless.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. You've covered, I know that you have a lot of passion in space. I do too, actually. I love watching that stuff. You've covered a lot of stories in the U.S., and you've been in over 80 countries around the world reporting stuff. How do you do that traveling? I mean, that's a lot of traveling. Do you have any interesting stories about certain cities that you've been to that you may never go back to again?
Well, probably most of them. But, I mean, travel's as interesting as anything else. Travel is as interesting as anything else because of your destination and even because of the mode of travel. To get on a plane, I live in Colorado, so to get on a plane at one of the world's most modern airports, at least America's most modern, Denver International Airport, DIA, and, you might have to change planes a couple of times, but when you get off, you're in some very backward third world country. And vice versa, you get on in third world country and you come home. I used to come home from some pretty terrible places, terrible in terms of what had happened there, whether it was a terrible war or all wars are terrible, or a natural disaster and a couple of thousand people died in an earthquake or a flood. And I'd come home and ask my wife, how everything was, and the dishwasher had been broken, and I'd say, "Oh, that's such a small problem." But you know what? In her world, or in my world today, that's our big problem today.
Right.
So, the answer to the question is really changing. I'm still fascinated by the ability to go from one piece of the world to another piece, not just a different geographical piece, but a different cultural piece, a different societal piece, to go from peace to war and back. With the simplicity of a couple of visits to the airport. On the other hand, you also see some cultural things just by and I want to keep this clean here, but this was the airport, and I'm trying to remember where. Oh, this is in Khartoum, in Sudan, sort of the northeastern part of Africa. And the way I'll try to keep it clean, I hope this is okay.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Podcast,
it's radio.
Is that when I went in to use the bathroom facilities, like a lot of third world places, there is no toilet.
There's a hole in the floor, right?
There's a hole in the floor. But here's the worst part.
Uh-oh.
There's no toilet paper. There is, those indents where you put soap in a shower.
Yes.
there's an indent and a sponge.
Lovely. You mean like a group sponge? Is that it?
The group sponge. There you go.
Lesson learned. Bring your own paper.
Oh my God, that's an interesting story.
Or baby wipes.
Yeah, that's right. You've written. I know you've authored a college textbook called "Better Broadcast Writing, Better Broadcast News," and you also wrote a book, "Life in the Wrong Lane." Tell me what that's about.
Yeah. Well, Life in the Wrong Lane is about all of the wacky things and the funny things and the stupid things and the silly things and sometimes the smart and triumphant things that foreign correspondents do. There are a couple of domestic stories as well, but that correspondents do just to get to the point of reporting a story.
Right.
And so for news junkies who, watch people on TV or read what they are reporting online or in a printed paper.
That's me.
And if they ever wonder, well, I wonder what it took just to get there. That's what the book is about, because it's life in the wrong lane. I covered Hurricane Katrina, for example, and I remember seeing, I guess it was after the fact, a shot taken from a helicopter. Jeff, you've probably seen these 1,000 times.
Yes. Taken
from a helicopter of some interstate highway, and I don't remember anymore whether it was Florida or Texas or Louisiana, but it was a traffic jam getting out. And those were the northbound lanes if it was in hurricane country in this country.
Right.
And the southbound lanes, you could do push-ups.
Really?
It was empty. And all of a sudden in this helicopter shot that might have lasted 5 seconds, some car goes whistling south in the empty lanes. And I said, yes! Those are the journalists.
Right.
There are other first responders.
Right. Everyone's trying to get out, and they're going in.
Some journalists in the wrong lane. All the smart people are trying to get out. You're trying to get in.
Amazing, isn't it? It's in your blood, right? You have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you feel? Speaking of that, what's your feeling about the state of cable news? This 24 hours, 7-day-a-week reporting where you have to spend so much time on one story that they'll spend hours and hours. What do you think about that? Because, when you and I were doing this in the 70s, there was no cable TV. It was the networks, and that was it, and local TV. Is it good that we have all this news 24/7?
I could say, don't get me started.
I know.
But
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
The answer is yes, it's good for some people.
Right.
It's good for people, number one, who want the nonstop commentary, which sometimes is nonstop but nonstop repetitive, but sometimes there's something new.
Right.
It does, when you and I were working in the business, at least in its heyday, and it's amazing to me
the better
that
days.
The heyday came and went in a single career.
Yeah.
But people would run home if they were television news watchers, and they were sitting on the edge of their seat to find out what happened today, because they didn't have the internet. They didn't have a TV monitor up in the corner with 24-hour coverage. That's what's changed. As a result, one of the most unfortunate byproducts, in my opinion, and this is, the internet figures in here too, is that there's more of an emphasis than there used to be on being first than on being right.
Right.
I mean, you and I both know sometimes you'd sit on stories for a long time and hope that your competition, and there was a lot less competition in those days, didn't have it and didn't get it out before you did. But you'd sit on it to double and triple check it. They don't do that so much anymore. Sometimes they do, but it's more important to get it on the air, even if it isn't necessarily accurate and certainly not complete. I say it's more important. It seems that they see it as more important. I don't think it's more important. Sometimes it's disgracefully wrong because of that attitude. But that's just,
Well, that's the nature.
I never wanted to give up my typewriter in favor of a laptop, but I finally did.
Typewriter, what's that? There's a whole generation that has no idea what a typewriter is.
This is true.
Right?
Younger than me, Jeff, I promise.
Younger than you,
I still
for
remember
sure.
what a typewriter is.
Yes, definitely younger. My son's age probably doesn't know what a typewriter, or maybe he does.
Wow.
There's got to be a favorite story of yours that you remember that sticks with you for whatever reason, whether it be good, bad, memorable, whatever. Is there a story that you just always remember and you always like telling that story?
Well, there are a few. I'll tell them as
Tell me a
quickly as
favorite
I
one.
can. Well, my favorite one, I guess, because it's kind of funny, involves a guy who's thankfully not with us anymore, Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya.
Yes.
And there was a terrible pair of terrorist attacks at airports in Europe, 2 Western airports, where terrorists in both cases went in and just started firing with automatic or semi-automatic weapons and killed a bunch of people in line to check in for flights at both of these airports. And this was back in the Reagan years. Reagan was president, and he pointed immediately at Gaddafi. Well, a camera crew and I were somewhere in Southern Europe, and we got called, and they said, charter a plane and get to Libya right away. So we did. And as soon as we landed, they decided not to let other journalists in. And I applied for an interview with the leader, with Gaddafi, who I had interviewed several times. And we waited around, cooled our heels at the hotel for a couple of days, because that's how it worked. And finally, I got a call at about 2 a.m. from the minister of information,
right,
who said, "You and your crew be outside in half an hour." This is at 2 a.m.
Oh, God.
And he didn't tell me why. And I called the crew and I said, "I don't know what it's about. Maybe it's an interview, maybe it's not. But it's an awfully strange hour." But I said, humor me and let's meet outside. Sure enough, we get picked up. I fell asleep. We drove around for a couple of hours, and it's dawn. And we awaken, and we're by the side of a field, a farm field, and there off in the distance, way off in the distance, is a flanks of men running alongside a tractor in the lead, an open tractor, just a simple, as a matter of fact, it was a Massey Ferguson tractor.
Right.
And we go running, and it had rained the night before. We'd evidently driven well south of the capital, Tripoli. And when we get up close, sure enough, the men running alongside are all holding machine guns, and the man driving the tractor is the leader, Gaddafi.
Wow.
And I stop him, and he acts surprised. "Oh, what are you doing here?" The whole thing obviously was set up. And so we make small talk because we've run probably a quarter mile carrying our equipment, including me. I always carried a couple of extra batteries and the tripod.
Right.
And the cameraman and the sound man are getting set up, and they're catching their breath. And the cameraman gives me and I'm making small talk with Gaddafi, but it's over the sound of the tractor.
Right.
And the cameraman gives me the eye to say, "Okay, I'm ready for the real interview." So I said, "Colonel Gaddafi," I'm shouting, "but can you turn off the tractor now?" He said, "Well, of course." I had already asked him, "What are you doing, by the way?" And he said, "I am tilling the fields for the people."
Oh, my
I always
God.
till the fields for the people. So when I asked him to turn it off, he says, of course, to save his life, he cannot find the key to the tractor, the ignition.
Yeah.
And finally, one of his machine gun toting aides
Right.
sees
Just shot
his
into it or
comfort,
something. Yeah.
does it. This is the man who tills the fields for
Right.
the people.
Right.
I'm not sure he had ever been on a tractor before
Right.
in
Of
his
course
life.
not. Of course. That's a great story. That's a great story. Tell me what you're doing now, Greg. I know you do speaking engagements as well. Is that what you're doing now? What are you doing now?
Well, 2 things. Well, 4 things. I ride my bike whenever possible.
Great.
I live in the mountains of Colorado, and I ski when you can't ride anymore. But maybe more importantly, for the purpose of the question, I gave a speech this morning, for example, about the threats, the terroristic threats that face us and that continue to change, using, for example, the bike path truck killer, bad name for it, the guy who drove the truck on the bike
Yes, in New
path
York.
on the Hudson in Lower Manhattan on Halloween.
Right.
That's a whole new weapon. You and I used to know what terrorists looked like. They had
Right.
machine guns over their shoulders. Maybe they had dynamite strapped to their chests.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's somebody with a
car.
steering wheel between his fingers.
Right.
So I give talks about terrorism and some of the things that have changed and some of the threats that have changed or are still facing us, like the quantum computer, which, whoever develops it first, if they want to, can disrupt, even ruin our entire infrastructure for transportation and energy and information and all the rest. And I write newspaper columns, generally political and more than anything else about foreign affairs. I say this about foreign affairs. If I tell you that I understand some of these people with whom we are trying to deal, kick me out of the room.
Yeah, right.
But what I do understand is how little we understand. And
Right.
sometimes I think, or at least I wish, our diplomats, and I don't care whether you're talking to a Republican or a Democratic president, I wish they understood as much.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. And with this Russia thing, I don't think the average person knows who to believe anymore.
Yeah, I sure don't know.
Yeah,
I have my
it's-
suspicions. I guess we all do. But, yeah, it's a tough one.
It's pretty crazy. So if somebody wants to have you speak at an engagement, what do they do? Do they go to your website? Do they go to a place?
Yeah, I guess they go to gregdobbs.net. Sure.
Perfect. I'm always there to help you, Greg. Anywhere. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm a big fan of yours.
The check is in the mail.
Yeah, there you
I'd
go.
like to listen, I've been in the business all my life. I've been for the majority of my life, a correspondent, but I've also been and continue to be a newspaper opinion columnist. I have I've done long form, meaning documentary, and also minute and 15-second stories. My job all my life has been, and I'm the author of a couple of books, to communicate information. And so that's the fun about making speeches about the world. As long as you stay current. If I don't stay current, then I'm out of business.
Right.
But as long as you stay current, because things are changing every day. If I were to talk to you about the Middle East today and then talk to you again tomorrow, it'd be a whole different conversation. It's changing that fast.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? It really is something. Here's the toughest question for you, Greg. What advice would you give a student that's looking to get into this crazy business? What would you suggest them to do? Don't
give up.
Okay.
There are fewer major news organizations than there used to be. Well, I won't put it that way. None of the news organizations is as big, meaning none of them has as big a reach as they used to. You remember in our heyday, on a really big day, big news day, my God, each network had 20 to 30 million viewers, each one.
Yep.
These days, the three of them together typically don't get that many. Throw in cable, it's only a little bit more. The internet, of course, captures a lot of the audience as well. But the job is still there. It's not about how many people you're reaching. It's about what you're getting to do with your life. Mm-hmm. And you're getting a very exciting life. Even if you're covering city council, you're not always doing the kinds of things I've been talking to you about. But every day is different, and you're getting to see things firsthand and then communicate them to everyone else. And it's quite a responsibility if you stop and think about it and put aside the whole issue of fake news. It's a privilege to be able to report to an audience that wants to know, how's my world working today?
Yeah, it's amazing. And I could tell the passion that you have, and I think that's also important to have, to be curious and be passionate at what you do. And you certainly show that. I mean, it's very easy to tell from just talking to you for a short bit here how passionate you are about the business, about the world, and how people think and hear the news.
Well, thank you. You're right. I don't say that with false modesty, but I am passionate about it, and I do love doing it.
You are, and you're very good. And I really appreciate you doing this. I think you've given a lot of interesting stories and advice and opinions and thoughts, and that's exactly what I was looking for. So, Greg, thank you again. I wish you only the best and safe travels, and I hope we talk again soon.
Likewise. Enjoyed it, Jeff. Take good care.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. We'll be right back.
Sports radio host, producer, news anchor. Just a few of many more careers that the Connecticut School of Broadcasting could lead you to. Go CSB.com or call 1-800-TV-RADIO to schedule your studio tour. With an on-hands approach and instructors being broadcast professionals themselves, you're guaranteed to get a first-class learning experience. Get your career in the broadcasting field started the right way. Sports radio host, DJ, producer, news anchor, the Connecticut School of Broadcasting. Go CSB.com or call 1-800-TV-RADIO to schedule your studio tour today.
How many times have you wanted to let someone know that you were thinking about them and were at a loss as to what to send? Whether sympathy, friendship, love, inspiration, KarmicStones.com has you covered. They offer an expansive line of messages engraved in rocks that are sure to make an impressive statement. Cards get thrown away. A sentiment engraved in stone will be kept and remembered forever. KarmicStones.com offers the most unique and memorable gift ideas that are not only beautifully packaged and shipped, they're affordable and simple to send. Let them know you really mean it. After all, it's written in stone. Enter code PODCAST for 10% off your KarmicStones.com order today. That's KARMIC Stones.com.
And now, a final word.
Welcome back. Welcome back. So, Antonio, what do you think?
I'm thoroughly impressed, to put it gently.
He has something that I always tell everyone you got to have in this business, and that's passion.
Oh, he definitely has it.
He has the passion. He loves to do what he's doing. He has some great stories. I probably could talk to him for 3 hours easily.
I could tell. I probably could talk to him for a number of hours just because of what he's done, and had a question that would have gone in line because he's done, those stuff that's frontline,
Right.
frontline during war, so I could talk to him about that.
Yeah, he's done all of that stuff, and he was big on the space. Did a lot of the space shuttle stuff, a lot of stuff with NASA. I know he did that. That's why I was talking to him about it. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. He's a
very
really,
much so.
Really good guy. I'm glad I got to talk to him. Okay, so that's our podcast for today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me, jeff@jeffkreiner.com. Be happy to answer them. And until next time, Antonio, thank you.
You're welcome.
And we will keep in touch. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Cringer's Corner was recorded at the Palm Beach campus of the Connecticut School of Broadcasting.